All right, this is going to be the first half of the bio lecture, where we're going to do some of the basic aspects of evolutionary biology. And I'm looking for the correct set of slides here. Just 1 second. There we go. All right, this is technically one long presentation, but it generally takes at least 2 classes to get through. All right, so I'll break when we get to about the point where it usually stops. So this may be kind of a long video. We'll see. Hopefully, I'm going to try and keep it as narrow as possible. We'll cut out review stuff. We don't need to review science. You already have the recordings for that. Evolutionary theory. Some of this I already said in the other in the first video that I posted. We didn't get a definition for evolution, so here's a definition for evolution. Actually, here are 2. That's an important thing to know. Know both of them. Don't just know the simplest one, because I give you 2 so that one's easier to understand and one's more technical. In this case, the easier one to understand is change in biological species over time. Both of these were taken out of anthropology textbooks, by the way, biological anthropology textbooks, or general anthropology. Right? Neither was taken from a bio text necessarily, like just biology. It shouldn't be that different, though. In this case, it's probably not different at all. Descent with modification is the definition. I believe that was Darwin's phrasing. Right? Descent with modification. So change in biological species over time is fine. Understand and recognize descent with modification as well. It gives you a little bit more information. Right. I should point out that evolution can be used in non-biological settings as well. Right, so we could take out the biological, and we could say languages, and we talk about the evolution of languages or biological species. Take out biological species, put in languages. Say we could talk about change in languages over time. Call that evolution as well. For our purposes today, though, we're talking about biological evolution. Right? So change in biological species over time. Descent with modification. As I said, it's explaining the same thing, just slightly differently. Right? Descent implies there's change from one generation to the next. And modification is the change, right? So it's a little bit more specific in that it hints at the generations at play. It doesn't. It's not like individual members. The first one could lead you to think that individual members change over time, and that's what evolution is. That's not the way it works. It's change from one generation to the next. So the second definition is actually better, although the first one's not wrong. It just can be misinterpreted. So descent with modification. Descent from one generation to the next with modification, some kind of change from one generation to the next. And generally those are the changes in frequency of traits. They can be changes in traits themselves. We'll get into that a little bit as we go. All right, now, I pointed out already that evolution is something that was recognized by people at least around 10,000 years ago, because that's when we started domesticating animals. Once again, the definition of domestication is when people modify the genetic material of plants or animals for their own benefit. In order to do that, they have to recognize that evolution is happening. There is descent with modification, and that we can begin to control that descent. Right? Meaning we can choose the individuals that are allowed to mate with each other. Right, it's called selective breeding. Right, so people selectively breed individuals within a population of, say, animals. Could be plants as well, but we'll say animals for now. Say they were hunting and gathering. They were chasing around, herding animals for their entire existence, and they got to know the behavior of those animals really well. And then they sort of tamed some of them. That taming is different from domesticating. Taming is just habituating animals to your presence, getting them used to having you around. I suppose they, captured some of them and they'd herd them separately from the wild ones, and they would gradually breed them deliberately to be more tame over time, and that is the process of domestication. Right, so around 10,000 years ago, this first happened. The first thing that we domesticated were dogs, and you can imagine how that works. Go back to the scenario: people hunting, herding animals, and who's competing with them? Wolves. All right, so they're out there with wolves. People aren't great friends to wolves. On the other hand, wolves have some things in common with people. They understand, innately understand hierarchies. Right? There's a wolf social structure that is not the same as human social structure, but it fits in. Right? We can figure out how to negotiate with them, so to speak. So it wasn't a huge accident. They probably killed off the adult wolves because they were directly competing with them, but then they had baby wolves left around, and so they'd keep the baby wolves and gradually throw out the ones that tried to murder him in their sleep, and keep the ones that didn't try to kill him. And gradually, that ended up with dogs. So over a long period of time of taking out the most aggressive wolves from the dogs, from the baby wolves that were left behind, and letting the other ones breed, eventually got what we call domesticated dogs, which came directly from wolves. It's arguable in terms of the classification of species. We'll get to that a little bit later too, in terms of how that works. But dogs can breed with wolves. We've already gotten a definition of species. Generally speaking, dogs can breed with wolves without too much trouble. All right, so it somewhat violates our definition of species to call them both separate species. That may have actually changed. It used to be that wolves were called Canis lupus, so genus Canis, some kind of dogs, and lupus meaning wolf. And then it was, domesticated dogs are called Canis familiaris, so same genus, different species. I think there's been a movement to shift back toward calling dogs Canis lupus familiaris and making that distinction at the subspecies level. But I haven't kept up on it entirely. So I know it used to be Canis lupus, Canis familiaris. Never seen as different species. In any case, they were the first things that we domesticated. So around 10,000 years ago. Led to the dawn of civilization, as the other chart said in the previous recording. All right, so when did people start to actually try and figure out how evolution worked? That didn't happen until science came around. And so that would be in the 1700s, 1800s, when science started to take hold in the West. You could argue that there was science before that, but modern science really began around that time. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is known as one of the people who came up with a widely accepted within the scientific community, mechanism for evolution. A mechanism means a means by which it happens. Right, so he came up with the idea that acquired traits are inherited. And you'll often see that phrase when people are discussing Lamarck. Acquired traits are inherited. It means things that happen to you during your lifetime can be passed on to your offspring. Right, and this got some traction. It did make sense in some circumstances. Of course, we talked earlier about it during the methodology lecture about the fact that science is cumulative in nature. So Lamarck was just starting to try and figure out this problem. Given that we have a couple hundred years of science in between us and Lamarck, excuse me, it should be easy for people in the class to see how that's really not the case. There's been all kinds of science in between that has disproven that idea. Things that happen to you during your life are not really passed on as a rule to your offspring. For example, if you get in an accident and lose an arm, you're not going to have one-armed children. So that disproves the basic claim that acquired traits are inherited. Now, there may be some circumstances in which that does happen, particularly if things affect your genetic material and your reproductive organs, and so that can be passed on to the traits. Maybe it causes mutation. Mutation is just a change in genetic material. Right? So anything that causes mutations during your life does get passed on, right? But other things, they don't. Right? So Lamarckian evolution has generally been rejected in favor of natural selection, which is what we're mostly going to talk about here. Alfred Russel Wallace, I bring him up just because he's part of the Darwin story. He started working on the same problem. He's a naturalist. Naturalists are scientists. They're biologists who go out and study nature and catalog nature. And I'm not sure if there are very many biologists today who call themselves naturalists, but in the 19th century there were a whole bunch of them because nature had generally not been categorized. It had not been analyzed in that way. So Darwin was also a naturalist, and he was around a little bit before Wallace. So Wallace was younger, and he kind of got on the same trail because they were doing the same kind of thing. And Wallace kind of lit a fire under Darwin to publish stuff he'd already been thinking about. We're going to skip those giraffes and go to Darwin here. Right. So when was Darwin around? 1809 to 1888. Also a naturalist, and he's famous for traveling to the Galapagos Islands, which was really interesting from the point of view of a naturalist because you had multiple islands in a chain, and each one of them had slightly different microclimates, and so you had various species which had adapted to those different biological niches. So you could study a lot of different things in a compact space. So that's why that particular trip to the Galapagos was so famous where Darwin was concerned. And it contributed heavily to On the Origin of Species, which was, how to correct that, that's a slightly incorrect title. On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859 and outlined Darwin's concept of natural selection. And we're going to get the most basic elements of that, but before we do that, we're going to run through a bunch of vocabulary so we understand what we're talking about. All right, so he outlined the entire thing in On the Origin of Species in 1859. Again, that was initially he was hesitant to publish that because the science was taking place in the Christian world, and that's something we forget about today because we're living largely a secular world. I mean, there are lots and lots of religious organizations, religious people, but it doesn't dominate society in the way that it did in the 19th century, right? So it would have been the entire scientific community was interacting and doing work in the context of a religious reality, and that was Christianity in the West, right? And Christianity had an origin story, and Darwin understood that what he was discovering in nature kind of violated that origin story, so he kind of held off publishing. Now, nobody else expected that that could be possible because they're all Christian. They understood the Word of God was how it happened, and then they were doing science, which is a legitimate investigation of nature, and there's no way that should uncover anything that contradicts the story of God. It just didn't make any sense. So Darwin was afraid that people would laugh at him. If he they wouldn't take him seriously. They'd think he made a mistake. It must be a mistake because you can't discover anything that contradicts reality, as far as they know. In any case, so he was hesitant to publish this. He did not make a connection to human evolution at the time. So he didn't directly challenge that creation story at all. He just talked about it in terms of animals, plants. There was a posthumous publication, 1892, after his death. Posthumous literally means, post means after, humus means dirt, so literally after you die and are buried, it gets published. So the other people published this, people who apparently were close to him. I don't remember exactly the story of it, but the connection between human evolution and natural selection was made in Descent of Man. So if you're interested in any of that, those are the major two of the major works that you'd want to have a look at. All right, so natural selection, once again, we'll be coming back to that and get sort of the simplest understanding of it after we get some vocabulary. First vocabulary term that we need to get is species. Again, it's the unit of analysis in evolutionary studies generally. They talk about species all the time. We already went through this in, I think, in the previous slide, and I think I might have mentioned it before. So species is a group of like organisms which can breed and produce fertile offspring. So you got 3 check boxes if you want to figure out if 2 organisms are the members of the same species. First thing you do is look and see if they're alike. So I'm going to use a sort of classic example. It gets used in bio classes all the time. Get a horse and a donkey. And people who are familiar with this know exactly where I'm going. Do they look alike? Yes, they're alike. So they're alike organisms. We can check the first box. The next question is, can they breed? That's the second box. The answer is yes. They can breed and they produce a mule pretty consistently. So that's the second box. 2 out of 3 so far are saying they're the same species. Now, the third question that we have to answer in order to figure this out is whether that mule can have fertile offspring or can have offspring. Is the mule fertile or infertile? And the answer is that they're sterile. All right, so technically, horse and donkey are separate species, even though they look alike and they can breed. Their offspring are sterile. So that's where we draw the line. And we have to bear in mind, there's another example that I walked through in class I'm not going to bother with here. We have to draw the line somewhere for our own analytical purposes. Nature doesn't really care where we draw the line. There are lots of gray areas, right? Evolution will explain how evolution by natural selection works, and you get an idea of the process, and you'll probably be able to see how it can get fairly messy and doesn't lead to clearly defined species all the time. There are some species can't breed with each other no matter what, like a bird and a fish. They're not going to, for a number of reasons, they're not going to, or a bird and a snake or a fish and a snake. Those things are so different they can't breed with each other at all. Like, it just can't even happen. These ones are close enough because of the way that this works out, right? And we'll walk through that process here shortly. But bear in mind, we impose these names like species and genus on the things we see in nature because that's the way we're trying to understand them. We have to be able to analyze it. We have to be able to name categories. And nature doesn't care about our categories, right? So just bear that in mind as we go through these. Species has a clear definition. It's not always applied in the same way. And that's because it doesn't always fit to nature the way that we would like. In some cases, it absolutely does. Most cases, really, but not all. All right, we're not going to worry about these lions and tigers. We'll go past them. Here, this is another thing I want to smooth out in the next draft of this whole thing. There are a bunch of terms that I throw in here that are not on the slides at all. Right? And what I'm trying to get across is the basic process of speciation. That's probably what my starting point will be when I redo this. Speciation refers to the formation of new species, the process by which new species are formed. Right? And we already got the definition of species, so we know what that is. Like organisms can breed and produce fertile offspring, so it's a big bunch of organisms, some kind of, let's for argument's sake, just say it's rabbits. Right? It doesn't matter what you pick. Say we got a bunch of rabbits that are all members of the same species. Next, we have to get down to the term population, which again is not on this slide. Population is spelled the same way it normally is in conversation. Population is a group within a species that can and does regularly interbreed among themselves. All right, so go back to your big bunch of rabbits. Say you got 500 rabbits in a field. There are a bunch of rabbits on one side of the field that don't really breed that much with the rabbits on the other side of the field. Draw a line right down the middle, like the 50-yard line in a football field. So football field full of rabbits, half of them are on one side, half of them on the other. Because they don't breed with each other across that 50-yard line very much, they constitute separate populations. Right? Population is a group within a species, can and does regularly interbreed among themselves. So as long as they stay on their own side of the field and don't cross it too much, they're considered to be separate populations within the same species. They can still biologically reproduce with one another, but they don't as often as they do among their own group. Right, so that's what a population is. Group within a species can and does reproduce among themselves on a regular basis. Right. Now, we need to get the concept of gene flow, which is something that prevents speciation from happening in the situation where you have the rabbits in the football field opposite the 50-yard line, right? Gene flow is what happens when genetic material moves from one population to another. So while they don't regularly interbreed, and so they're separate populations, every once in a while, one of those rabbits will hop across the 50-yard line and breed with the other group. If this happens every once in a while, and it happens enough, it will prevent speciation from occurring. Right? That is to say, they won't change enough from each other between gene flow, between incidents of gene flow, to become new species. That is to get so different from one another that they can't interbreed. There'll be enough genetic material moving back and forth between the two populations that they won't become separate species. They'll be able to continue to breed with each other. All right, so that's speciation, that's population. Gene flow is something that prevents speciation. Isolation is what leads to speciation. Right, so take the same population of rabbits on the football field, something that keeps them from creating any gene flow, something that prevents them from going across that 50-yard line and bringing their genetic material with them, is an isolating factor. In biology, they talk about different sorts of isolation. These are two. We didn't get into all of them, but these are two. And there are names for animals or plants that are in this condition. Right. So geographic species refers to groups within a species. Technically, they're the same biological species. They can breed and produce fertile offspring at the biological level, but there's something that prevents them from reaching each other. Right. Some geographical barrier. Right. I'm not going to worry about the owls and all this other stuff. I'm just using this example. Right. So suppose football field full of rabbits, 50-yard lines, population on one side, population on the other. Somebody digs a ditch down the middle, and it's really wide and they can't swim or whatever. I don't know if rabbits, I assume they can swim, but let's say these rabbits can't swim. Special rabbits can't swim. Dig a ditch down the middle, fill it with water, maybe put some alligators in there or something, make sure they don't get across. So that's a geographic barrier that prevents, even though they can breed with each other, it prevents gene flow from happening because they're not going to be able to cross that geographic barrier. During that time, we would call the two populations of rabbits geographic species. They're still the same biological species as each other, right? But we consider them to be separate geographic species because there's a geographical barrier that's preventing them from breeding with one another. Another form of isolation that can lead to speciation. So geographic species can lead to speciation. Eventually, if that goes on long enough, they'll both be exposed to separate selective pressures, that is, pressures in the environment that select for different traits. There'll be a degree of randomness. There will be potentially mutations in this process of evolution. Mutation is a change at the DNA level. Right, so we should know what a mutation is as well. So those separate paths of evolution will carry them farther and farther apart until eventually they cannot breed together. Now that's the speciation that will occur. If there's a geographic species, they're separated, can't breed. That'll eventually happen over time. Right. Mechanical species refers to a circumstance, and I will use a slightly different example just because it's handy and it works. There's our owl. Okay, I'm going to talk about Canis familiaris in this case, or Canis lupus familiaris, depending on nomenclature that you use. Specifically because people have bred them to be very different from one another physically. We bred large dogs like the Great Dane for warfare and guarding and things like that, and maybe other kinds of work. We bred really small species, at first for vermin control, chasing rats down holes and things like that, like a Chihuahua. Later for just ornamental dogs, just for pets. And so we ended up with different populations that are physically very different from one another. So we might call some of them, these two in particular, mechanical species, because while they're both members of the same species, we can take sperm and eggs from either one from each of them, put them together in a laboratory. We can create a dog, right? If there's a dog that can equally breed with both of them, then there can still be gene flow between these two populations. But they're considered to be mechanical species because they're just too physically different to actually breed between the two. Great Dane or Chihuahua, physically it doesn't work. They can't breed with one another, even though biologically it's possible. Right? So that would be a circumstance in which there's mechanical isolation, and we call the populations that are experiencing that mechanical species. They're still members of the same species, Canis familiaris or Canis lupus familiaris, depending on which notation you use. Still members of the same species, different mechanical species because they physically can't pass genetic material back and forth. All right. So if we understand speciation, we understand the term population, we understand the term gene flow, mutation, I think we're good. All right. So that's the basic process by which this works. You have a population of animals you have a species of animals breaks into populations. If those populations are isolated from each other for a long enough period of time, there are different selective pressures, and that's where we get back to natural selection. Right? We'll explain how that works in a second here. That goes on for long enough, speciation occurs. You get two new species, or two separate species anyway. All right, moving on. All right, we're getting back to natural selection at this point, now that we have that terminology under our belt. Darwin recognized a couple of interesting things, and so did Alfred Russel Wallace, by the way, when he was studying Darwin on the Galapagos Islands and other places, studying nature, cataloging, measuring things, drawing pictures of things, realized that there, first of all, is variation within species. That is, every member of a species is not the same as every other member. And that's something you can easily see if you're a human and you look around at all the people around you, you can tell one from another. Even if they're identical twins, they're going to be very similar, but there still will be small differences between them, and you can learn the differences. Excuse me. So there's variation within species. In other words, each individual has a different set of traits slightly than every other individual. Right? Another thing that Darwin noticed was that more individuals are born than can survive to reproduce. All right. So in other words, there's something called differential reproduction. And that's actually on the next slide. We can get it here. Differential reproduction just means that some individuals pass on their traits more readily and regularly than others. All right. So one individual, if you think about people, right? Say you grow up, get married, you have 2 kids, and your brother has 8 kids. There's differential reproduction between you as an individual and your brother. Your brothers have more kids than you are. Right. This could be absolute differential reproduction, in which case maybe you have 0 kids. Maybe you have 0 kids and your brother has 8 kids. Then a lot of his genetic material is being passed on, and none of yours is. Right, so that's sort of absolute differential reproduction. That's what happens when, say, individuals die and don't pass on their genes at all. But other ones survive and pass on their genes. Okay. Natural selection is what determines which traits will be retained from one generation to the next, and which ones will be eliminated. Right, so that's what that process, that term actually refers to, that process of selecting which traits will be passed on. And what is the major factor? It is the environment. Now, you all may have heard the term survival of the fittest, and a lot of people associate that with Darwin. I want to point out that did not come from Darwin. It came from a guy named Herbert Spencer, and is associated with something called social Darwinism, which was social theory that he was trying to capitalize on the success of Darwinian evolution at the time. It was well known within scientific circles, and he was borrowing some of the terminology, but didn't necessarily understand how it worked out well. Herbert Spencer was trying to explain inequality in the rapidly developing industrial system in Western Europe. Right. So the idea was there was one trait that made everybody fit, and if you didn't have it, you weren't that fit. And so it was about the survival of the fittest. And fitness, of course, in human circles was smart, intelligence, being smart. So his idea that people were poor because they weren't that smart, and people were rich because they were really smart. Right. So there was this ultimate fitness that he had conceived of in his mind. Now that's a different thing from what Darwin was talking about. When Darwin talked about fitness, it was always in the context of an environment. Right. So we need to throw that other phrase pretty much out of the window when we talk about Darwin. A better example is, or a better phrasing that matches it more clearly is survival of the best adapted. Right, so it's about adapting to an environment. The thing that makes you fit today can make you unfit tomorrow. Right, in other words, we'll go through the moths a little bit. A classic example of this was the peppered moth example. And this is a type of moth that lived in the United Kingdom, still lives there as far as I know. Excuse me. It had two color variants, right? And the color variants existed more or less in equal proportion, or maybe it was a little heavily toward the lighter colored moths. Your book talks a little bit about this. There are some questions I have about the way that the book presents some of the things. I've seen other presentations of it. In any case, you get the idea. We'll walk through it a little bit. One moth, two variants. So different traits. Again, variation within populations is part of that variation. Some are light colored, some are dark colored. Same species. They lived in an environment in which there were trees growing. Right, so they lived on trees, and the trees had dark bark, which is pretty common among trees, unless you're talking about birch or something. And there was a type of lichen that grew on one side of the tree pretty consistently, a particular species of tree. The lichen was light colored. So literally, excuse me, let me see if I can see an example of this. All right, here we go. There's the lichen and there's the non-lichen side of the tree. But opposite sides of the same tree. These moths could literally live on opposite sides of the same tree, and the coloration serves to protect them through camouflage. Right? So because they can blend into their environments, that's the significance of that trait. The equal distribution of the light and dark color variations indicates that both of them were equally successful in hiding from predators for a long period of time. Right, and that's explained by the nature of the trees having the lichen on one side. The light ones can live on the lichen side, and the dark ones can live on the other side, and they can easily have access to each other to reproduce. So that would maintain a roughly equal distribution of both the light and the dark variants. Right. Now, in the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, science was ramping up along with the Industrial Revolution. So the environment was changing at the same time that scientists were studying all aspects of nature. One or more scientists in particular were interested in studying these moths. They were looking at the frequency of traits and keeping track of the moth populations in a longitudinal study. They were looking at it over a long period of time. And they recognized that there was a change that was happening in the environment and was leading to a change in the moths, specifically the distribution of these light and dark traits. Industrialization, as I said, was going on. People were building factories. There were no emissions controls. There wasn't even a concept at the time, early in the Industrial Revolution. So they're just spewing out soot all over the environment. It was getting all of the trees, and the people, and the moths, and every other thing. So which one of these color variants was suddenly put at a disadvantage because of the soot being everywhere? Well, that's dark in color. So the dark-colored moths found plenty of places to hide. The lighter-colored moths were vulnerable because there were far fewer light-colored spaces where they could hide. All right, so they were being picked off by birds and other things that ate them, while the darker ones were staying camouflaged for the most part. So over that time, because biologists were charting the frequency of the traits, they noticed that there was a decline in the frequency of the white color variation, the lighter colored moths. And so there's an increase proportionally in the number of darker colored moths, because the white ones were just getting picked off and their genes weren't being passed on. Eventually, the environment changed back, not by some miracle, but because people started realizing they didn't like being covered in soot all the time, and they started controlling the emissions a little bit better from the factories, so the forests nearby reverted to their natural state. And what happened to the balance of the population? It rebounded. The lighter colored moth variant rebounded, I think, to be even dominant over the darker color variation. Right, that meaning there were more of them. There was a more common trait in the environment after the fact. Right. So this illustrates how some trait, any given trait, can make you very fit today, meaning it can, in terms of fitness, we're talking about things that increase reproductive success. So it can increase your chances of reproduction today, but if the environment changes, you're no longer adapted to that environment. So it decreases your chances of reproduction. Being eaten pretty much stops your reproduction. Right? So that's the role of the environment. And you can apply this to any kind of environmental change, because pretty much everything crawling or flying or swimming on the earth is adapted to a particular environment. People are the closest of any animal on earth to transcending this through cultural adaptation. That's the thing. We can adopt to huge climate changes, and certainly have through all of human prehistory, because we have cultural adaptation. We are adapted to a niche. Grasslands in Africa in a tropical zone, right? That's what we were initially adapted for. On the other hand, through cultural adaptation, we can live in any environment on Earth. People on Antarctica right now, McMurdo Station, and they can survive down there because of our cultural adaptations. We can adapt to pretty much anything. Moths can't. We can change any element of an environment. We're probably going to be displacing something or putting something at a disadvantage. Right. That's just how nature works. And these may be natural changes too. So it's not always. It doesn't necessarily have anything at all to do with human intervention, although it could. All right. So anything changing in the environment, it may change the balance of things like this, right? Because natural selection is dependent on the environment to determine which traits will be passed on, which traits will not. Right. Bird hats. Bird hats. I've included those because it's a memorable thing, and it also introduces an important element of that environment, which is cognition. Right? There's thinking that goes on in this environment. It's not just an unthinking, unfeeling, natural ecosystem. There are individual organisms in there, and in the bird hat example, a picture of bird hats. And I did post the research article on this if you're interested in it as an optional reading. So if you want to look at the details of this, you're welcome to look at it. Bird is not technically hats exactly. It's false crests. A crest on a bird is a bit of feather that sticks up on their head. You've probably seen certain birds that have crests, and sometimes the crest is collapsible. They can take it down and put it back up, and sometimes they have a comb, which is made out of cartilage, but if it's made out of feathers, it's called a crest. Since Darwin, people had speculated that it had something to do with mating behavior because there was no other real purpose to it that was obvious. And so the hypothesis was that, it helped to entice. You usually see the crests on male birds, and so various species of birds. And so the hypothesis was that it was a part of the mating rituals of the male birds to attract females. All right, so they wanted to test this hypothesis, and so the scientists in question, who were in Australia, as I recall, chose 2 native finches. These are those finches. And they set about gluing little hats on the birds to mimic this crest to see if it changed their reproductive success. And it turned out it did. As I recall, the female birds really liked the males with the lighter colored feathers on their heads, the white feathers, but they didn't like they had red and blue, I think, too, and they didn't like those as much. So they could actually chart the reproductive success increasing with certain hats on them, and see it decreasing when they put other hats on them, right? if you want to read the article, it gives you the methodology, tells you how they did that, right down to the glue that they use on the birds, and also explains the details of the long-term study, and the length of the study, and what birds are involved, and all that stuff. All right, so why am I talking about this? Because I want to illustrate sexual selection as a concept. Right? Sexual selection is part of the natural environment, and that's where the cognition comes in. The female birds have a cognitive process. They're looking at male birds and they're sizing up that male bird and deciding whether they want to mate with that individual and pass on those genes or not. Right? So there's a mind at work in the natural environment, and it's through sexual selection. So sexual selection is a term that you want to get. All right, that's all. We got differential reproduction, survival best adapted, not survival of the fittest, different thing. Natural selection, once again, is the mechanism that's widely accepted in the academic and the biological community as the mechanism for evolution. So natural selection is the one that we rely on. And we'll break there and pick up in another video on the human fossil record. All right. Shutting this down, and thank you very much. We'll get the other one going shortly.